questions I was going to ask you is, are you still in DC?
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you plan on staying?
Uh, well, if they make my life, difficult enough, we're obviously going to leave. But they removed all of the vaccine mandates. That was really the biggest thing, because if it was going to come down to me having to forcefully vaccinate my children, or at least against my wish, I wouldn't have done it. And also, DC, I don't know if you saw, they passed this law right in the middle of the pandemic, so that it doesn't get the full vote of the council, which is 12 people. During the pandemic, it was only 6 people voted on it, but DC passed an egregious law that people can secretly vaccinate your children without your consent.
Wow.
And to make it worse, they actually mandated the teachers, healthcare workers, and everybody else who is involved. They're actually required to actively lie to you if you ask about this. And you never get to see the bill. Only the insurance company does.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I don't know how they're getting away with this stuff. It's
Oh,
unbelievable.
well, it got blocked. Yeah, somebody sued, and basically, as of right now, there's an injunction on it because the federal judge took one look at it and said that cannot possibly be constitutional.
Wow.
So, yeah, if they had stayed, we would have been out.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like that. You can't really make plans because you don't really know what's going to happen. We're in a similar situation. I live in LA, I live in Venice, and my husband and I have a business here. We don't have kids, but it's like we're not sure if we should, we have a home in Florida. We're thinking of like going and going there, but we just don't know. You don't know. You can't make a plan because we do have like a brick and mortar wellness center where he sees clients. So it's hard to just pick up and start over somewhere else. But we also can't deal with the similar types of things that you guys are dealing with, which is still restaurants asking for vaccine papers, to all of that. So it's just so uncertain and weird.
I mean, DC lifted most of these, and that's kind of like while we're for the moment we're here. I would not hesitate to uproot everybody and move away if it comes down to somebody saying you cannot buy food unless you're vaccinated, or your child cannot go to the school that my tax dollars are paying for if it's not vaccinated, right?
Yeah, or you can't use
I don't
public
like that.
transportation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was super curious because the last episode I listened to with you, GA podcast was same. You were like, not sure, we're uncertain what's about to happen. So yeah. Feeling the same.
I mean, it's up in the air, to be honest. I mean, I'm ready to move because we don't have property here. The store, everything's virtual, shipped from a warehouse. So basically we're renting our place where we live. I don't have a car because in the city it doesn't make sense to have a car. So if need be, we can literally leave in a matter of hours. But I also don't like that uncertainty either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for some people it's exciting, but not when you have 2 small kids. They don't like that whole, we can go, we can stay, we can go, we can stay. Well, which one is it?
Yeah. And it's also really stressful just in general, So that's super interesting. And then as far as supply chains, I haven't noticed anything here in Los Angeles. And you talk about Whole Foods a lot. And I know that Whole Foods, because they're Amazon and Bezos, they're actively trying to replace, even prior to the pandemic, but they're just using it as more of an excuse to actively replace all of their major brands, or even starting with the mom and pop brands they used to carry, with the 365 brand. And start to private label and take over farms and private label things like mung beans and rice. And so you can't buy in bulk anymore because of COVID, but really they're private labeling off of farms and they're starting to buy up that farmland. So it's super sketchy to me, but we don't have, I haven't noticed the supply chain issue with our local stores. Are you guys still seeing stuff?
I meant more in the sense of producing the products, like so when you're bottling your creams and the other things you're selling. Do you have it? Are you using any of the plastic LDPE bottles that have a dropper, or are you more into the creams?
Yeah, no, both. So that we are. I was talking about like, getting my milk and cheese, but yeah, in terms of ONAs, absolutely. Like we are going, it's just from one order to the next, we just don't know. So all of a sudden guess what? We're out of, we're going to be out of this for a while, or all of a sudden we're using a dropper where we used to use a pump top or whatever. So it's just fly by the seat of our pants at this point.
So that part is up in the air. As far as the food in the local stores, I mean, there's still food. I don't think anybody has a sense that food is kind of like on the short side, that there will be a shortage of food, but the variety has drastically dwindled.
Yeah.
I think you heard me mention on the Danny podcast, there used to be an entire wall with nothing but dairy in it, like
Right.
20 different kinds of yogurt, right? Actually more than 20. 20 will be 20 brands of yogurt, and each brand would have several different kinds.
Yeah.
And now this wall, which used to be, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 feet long. It was just refrigerators, right, along the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Now there has basically, the refrigerators are still there, but 2/3, even more, have been replaced by these, again, 365 and other brands of like plant-based milk or plant-based yogurt. And I don't even know how they're allowed to call it that.
Milk.
Because, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And then there's just 1/3 of the original dairy area, and then the brands in there went down from, let's say, 20 down to 4 or 5, like Organic Valley, right?
Yeah.
Then there's also the 365. They also have their own organic like variety of that, but it's like just 3 or 4, right? And it's really it's kind of obvious they're pushing it towards the plant based living because the prices are lower a little bit. They're still making a lot of profit on the plant thing, but they're kind of pushing it towards. And then they have this consultant there. Every time you walk in, he or she will come and say, "Hey, I noticed you're looking at the yogurt, but did you know that if you replace this yogurt with like the cashew-based yogurt, it will be so much healthier?" And then they just don't leave you alone. You say, "Okay, thank you, appreciate it. I'm gonna get the yogurt." No. Here's this brochure. Take it home, read it, and it's just they're up in your face like that. Yeah.
Right. They're pushing the PUFAs and the plant-based. Yeah, that's amazing. We're really lucky here in LA because we have like Air One Market, and we have these like, sort of grocers that are fancy. And so, I mean, I remember when our Whole Foods used to carry raw milk.
Right.
That's how old I am. But
that's just only 5 years ago, right?
Exactly. And then all of a sudden there was this full on attack on raw milk. And we had a little grocer down the street here called Rawsome. And it was basically a little store that would carry Amish farmers kefirs, and they would make everything was grass fed, and everything, it was beautiful, everything was so good, raw milk. And then all of a sudden they came in with sniper units, and they came in and with a sniper team, and they shut down that place. There was pictures everywhere. They were pouring out raw milk into the gutters in the street. It was unbelievable. Had them at gunpoint, stopping them from selling raw milk.
Raw milk, yeah, because you're threatening the health of the population. How dare you? How dare you sell food that people like?
That's good for you.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Well, that's not what I was going to talk about, but it's still good stuff. Okay, so that I work for ONAS now, but you probably don't know that I started out just doing gut health, and my mentors were Dr. Robert Marshall, who runs Premier, who ran Premier Research Labs, and then Donna Gates, who is Body Ecology Diet. She helps people to remediate their guts, healing candida, working with autistic kids. And my husband is a chiropractor, works with autistic kids and kids with a lot of gut dysbiosis. And so I came on and started doing all of this nutrition. And I was helping myself with my own gut health, but I couldn't hold a child. I kept miscarrying. Everything else was fine, but I just was having these nightmare periods. So I started a Facebook group. This was 7 years ago, along with this podcast. And all these women joined, and I was using NatPro progesterone cream, topical 3% at the time. It was great. It was tremendous for me. I had heard about Ray. I certainly had heard about Ray P because I was studying his work, but I don't know if his oil was up yet. His vitamin E yet was on sale then. But then I started to still have issues. And then Ona joined my group, and people started talking about her stuff, started using her stuff. She asked me if we could collaborate, and then she passed away. And so then a couple of years, she had not related to, she had a catamenial epilepsy, actually, which is why she started ONAS, because she couldn't get a high enough concentration of progesterone that would help her to prevent her seizures. So her and her husband, who's a mad chemist, awesome man, went in and just created these higher concentrations, which completely kept her from getting these epileptic attacks. but then she had a heart condition, and that's a different
Yeah.
story. So he reached out to me a couple of years after, which was just recently, a year ago, and said, I didn't realize that you and Ona had all this, collaboration going on. Would you like to come on board as CEO of the company? I need help. It's tanked. We need help. And I was like, yes. He goes, just keep doing what you're doing. Your passion for progesterone is amazing. And you're in the same line of thinking as Dr. Pete and Katarina Dalton, and we need you. So here I am. Now I start hearing about this Georgi Dinkov guy from everybody, every time I turn around, and all my
Who lives in a closet?
Georgie, he lives in a closet, but he's really cool. So I finally reached a tipping point, and I started to quote you, and I hadn't even met you yet. And I was like, okay, you know what? I need to find out. And then this young man who's by the name of who's named after one of your sons, his name is Constantine, and he's a
Really?
Twitter
Nice.
fan. He's a huge fan of yours. He finally came to me on Instagram and was like, I'm telling you, you've got to have this guy on your show because you guys are simpatico. So here you are. So I want to, and I'm so grateful. So I have a lot of questions, but I had to narrow the categories down. And the
Okay.
big one is insulin resistance. So most of my women are heading towards perimenopause or menopausal. And now we're getting younger women who are in their 30s going through perimenopause, even some late 20s going through perimenopausal symptoms.
Yeah.
And I guess the main question for you to start with is progesterone absorption. Now, Dr. Pete and you guys talk about, smaller doses of vitamin E oil dissolved and taken orally. And all my listeners know about that as well. So tell me why some women do better with that, but a lot of women like myself, I couldn't really do the oil. In fact, I would get quite nauseous.
Yeah.
And so the big thing for me was lower strengths of topical cream over periods throughout the day. That's how it worked. If I did a big a big dose at once, like 400 milligrams before bed, it was mild. I had to do this low spread throughout the day. Can you speak on any of that?
Sure. Actually, take it orally, any kind of a product that contains vitamin E is a hit or miss for many people, but I think that's due more to the vitamin E than the progesterone that's dissolved in it. Vitamin E tends to stick to the wall of the intestine, and basically its absorption, a recent study came out, showed that it basically sits in your intestinal tract. About 20% absorbs when you ingest it, but then the remainder sits there until a meal with sufficient amount of fat comes along and then helps kind of like dissolve this vitamin E, dilute it to the point where it can be properly absorbed 100% and get into the bloodstream. So for many people, if they take the vitamin E, if it's too concentrated and not diluted enough with oil, they may experience intestinal irritation. And I guess a good way to test it is just get just a pure vitamin E product, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think Unique E is a fairly popular one. You can get it commercially, Unique-E. And just take one soft gel, and see if you get the same symptoms. Mm-hmm. And if you do, then it's probably, or most likely, the vitamin E that's causing this issue.
So the quality of the vitamin E.
And the concentration. Because when the progesterone is dissolved in vitamin E, most of the products, including Kenogen, they use I think it's 90% of the product is actually vitamin E. Then there's the progesterone and just a little bit of vegetable oil, vegetable triglycerides is what they call them, to just make it barely, just liquid enough so that it can come out of the dropper. Because if you use pure vitamin E without any diluent and you dissolve the progesterone in it, if you let it sit at room temperature, it can get so viscous. It's basically the consistency of a tar, and you cannot squeeze it out of the dropper. Not even through a pump. So you need something to dilute it enough to make it liquid. Otherwise, you will just sit there like a molasses. And yes, it's movable, but certainly not squeezable out through a bottle. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So if one thing to try is separate vitamin E product without any progesterone in it. And if that's the case, and if you confirm that it still gives you nausea and irritation, it doesn't basically make you feel good or better, which is what vitamin E is supposed to be doing if it's really like acting properly, then I guess just make sure you take the progesterone and vitamin E when you take it orally, take it with the biggest meal of the day. because that extra fat in the meal is going to help buffer some of these irritability effects on the intestinal wall.
Okay.
Uh,
So what if someone has some pretty serious gut dysbiosis though? What if they've got leaky gut? What if they're dealing with IBS? What if they're having malabsorption? I mean, isn't this something that's going to hinder absorption of a
yeah,
vitamin E progesterone at the gut?
very much could. And that may be another reason why some people do better on a topical than they do the oral.
Okay.
Now the vitamin E, I mean the Kinogen and other products that contain progesterone dissolved in vitamin E and oils, they can absorb topically too. It's just that the process is a lot slower, just as is with most other topical creams. And also the metabolism of the progesterone is changed. When you take it orally, dissolved in vitamin E, and if it absorbs properly, a majority of the progesterone stays unchanged as progesterone. When you get it through the skin, a good portion of it, maybe up to 30%, will get metabolized through an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase into 5-alpha dihydroprogesterone, and ultimately into something called allopregnanolone, which is a very strong anesthetic GABA agonist steroid, and it was recently approved, you may have heard, for postpartum depression. So a progesterone metabolite is now approved to treat postpartum depression in women, and now they're hoping to extend the indication, is what they call it, to all kinds of depression, not just postpartum. So if the women that you're working with, in general, men or women that you're working with, if they're having problems such as epilepsy or any other kind of a condition that is that involves reduced production of these reduced metabolites of progesterone, such as 5-alpha dihydroprogesterone, and especially allopregnanolone, they may benefit more from the skin application, because the skin contains high concentrations of that enzyme, 5-alpha reductase. So when you apply progesterone, you're getting more of those anesthetic, calming, anti-epileptic, steroids. While for the other people, basically, I think oral administration will be fine, as long as they don't get the intestinal irritation.
Okay, so the allopregnanolone, I thought for some reason that it was actually happens in the liver, and that it's usually for, so like I'll take Prometrium. I know it's peanut oil. I get it. A lot of women really opt for it because of the sleepiness and the calmness, and that's one of the main reasons that I'll take that at night, in addition to the other progesterones that I take throughout the day. So that's happening because of the allopregnanolone, right? The sleepiness and the drowsiness and that.
The progesterone itself is an anesthetic steroid. If you look, there's some studies from the early 20th century showing that it was used as a general anesthetic in veterinary medicine. They just started coming up with better versions. Well, they thought there were better anesthetics. In fact, they were more dangerous. But progesterone and several of its derivatives, including epipregnanolone, pregnanolone, and allopregnanolone, in some countries to this day, I think even in the United States, are still approved to be used as general anesthetics in veterinary medicine. They are that sedating. If you administer through an IV and you get a sufficiently high concentration, you will knock that animal or a person out. So it's hard to say how much of the orally taken Prometrium, the sedation of it, how much is it due to the progesterone directly, and how much to the liver metabolizing it into an even more potent, more sedating steroid such as allopregnanolone. But taking it orally and getting most of it through the liver is a good way to get a high amount of 5-alpha reduced steroid metabolites of progesterone into your bloodstream.
Okay, wow. Okay, so there are major issues I'm finding, and over having the group for this many years, and now we're almost at 20,000 people, which is really exciting. But something that is so different for everyone, it seems, is absorption. So, again, with the percentages, I just had pharmacist Carol Peterson, who is amazing, on the show, and she knows quite a bit about progesterone, and she was talking about so many variables that can actually interfere with progesterone absorption, like having a candida issue, like a chronic candida issue, and having a 3% versus a 20%. A lot of women love the 20%, but it's expensive. But it also, I put it on and I could not I could not absorb it. It was not, nothing was happening at all. So what are all the different, what's going on with the, how can we even get a baseline to it, suggest progesterone to people when we just don't have, when it's so individual with each person?
Well, precisely because of these inter-individual variations, which is what medicine calls them, for oral absorption of steroids, that is why they move towards creams, and specifically for women, vaginal suppositories. Because then the permeability of the vaginal mucosal layer is more or less similar across different women. And then if you give them a specific dosage based on how much they weigh, and unless they have some kind of an inflammatory disorder in the vaginal area, then you can kind of expect how much it will absorb, right? Same thing with sublingual, but you have to make sure that you tell the people to keep it in their mouth for a sufficient amount of time and not immediately ingest it, right? The issues with oral absorption, I think the ones, they stem largely from the fact of some kind of either infection or chronic inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract. And then when you take progesterone, basically, if the cells that are lining the intestinal wall, these epithelial cells, if they're not in a good condition, basically they have impaired permeability to a lot of these substances that we're ingesting. That's why you have people with Crohn's disease. They have extreme deficiencies in the B vitamins. And recent study found that if you give them an extremely high amount of an extremely high dose of oral vitamin B1, it actually completely removes their chronic fatigue that many of these people experience. And they found out that this was due to the fact that even though the blood levels of vitamin B1 in those people was normal, the intracellular levels of vitamin B1 were extremely low. And the reason these people, even though they were consuming regular amounts of food, a variety of foods, they shouldn't have, a normal person would not have a vitamin B deficiency with that kind of a diet. These people did because they had impaired absorption. And the impaired absorption, I think, spans a large number of beneficial substances, especially the vitamins and the steroids, which we happen to administer orally sometimes.
Wow. So this really just comes back to the gut, really. There's so much of it that comes back to the gut. Okay.
It is as Dr. Pavlov, the Russian physiologist, said, this is your closest link to the outside world. Is basically you are what you eat. And if the GI tract is not functioning properly, basically many people think that your vision or your hearing, that these are the closest things to your closest touch with the real world. It's not, because they get filtered through the brain. It's really the food that you're getting, which is a piece of the physical world that goes inside you. And the way you absorb it really determines how well in touch you are with the world around you.
Wow.
It's as primitive as that.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. That's really intense if you think about that, because there's so much gut, so much gut dysbiosis, so many gut problems. I mean, I could talk about that all day, but I have some statements I'm going to make, and then I want you to reply to these statements.
Sure.
I can't take progesterone. It makes me fat.
Well, has the person done any kind of a steroid blood work that can see basically how things are with cortisol, with prolactin specifically, how things are with dihydroepiandrosterone, which is very often low in people that struggle with excess weight, especially females, but males as well. And also how things are with progesterone itself. It also depends on basically how you take progesterone. If you take it in a manner which is the Prometrium, which has a very short-term effect, you may get to a point where basically initially the progesterone, the concentration rises sufficiently to suppress the levels of cortisol, but not enough. And then you have a rebound effect once the progesterone is cleared very quickly from the blood. And that kind of goes back to Dr. Pete's recommendations to people with severe estrogen dominance should be using higher dose of progesterone consistently for at least a week or two until they feel like their symptoms have resolved, and only then stop it or taper it off. Because if you take insufficient amount of progesterone, it can actually make your symptoms worse. You're giving a signal to the system that things are going into the right direction, but you're not giving a sufficient amount of progesterone to knock estrogen out of the cell, which is where it normally accumulates. And then progesterone in lower doses in some people because it is a precursor to cortisol, it may actually metabolize into cortisol. But in higher doses, progesterone inhibits the enzyme 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1, which synthesizes cortisol, while simultaneously activating the enzyme 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2, which deactivates cortisol. So in higher doses, progesterone inhibits the synthesis of cortisol, enhances its degradation, the degradation of cortisol into inactive metabolite, and also progesterone itself is a blocker of the cortisol receptor. And when you take progesterone in lower doses, it will not be high enough to inhibit the synthesis of cortisol, these two enzymes, or enhances deactivation, but it still has the cortisol receptor blocking effect. And several studies show that if you administer a cortisol receptor blocker, the levels of cortisol, blood levels of cortisol rise because the body interprets this as an insufficiency of cortisol. Something is blocking my cortisol receptors. I need to produce more. And the studies that I've seen with progesterone, the older studies, show that invariably higher doses, pharmacological doses of progesterone, actually lead to weight loss or at least fat loss, while the lower doses, at least in the animal studies, seem to demonstrate increased hyperphagia, is what they call it, basically increased appetite, which is one thing that can explain the increased weight, and also don't really deactivate the cortisol system strongly enough. And if the person is already struggling with some extra weight, this already implies they're having probably higher than optimal levels of cortisol and estrogen. So if you're not taking a sufficient amount of progesterone, initially you may be making things worse because you're giving the signal that things can go into the, into a better direction, but you're not really pushing the body, in that direction. I've experienced this myself. Lower doses of progesterone make me very irritable and almost lead to water retention, while higher doses invariably slim me down and put me to sleep. And this has worked every single time like clockwork. It doesn't matter if I cycle it. It doesn't matter if I take it in vitamin E or rub it on my skin. If I don't take a sufficient amount, which for me seems to be about 30 to 50 milligrams, I'm assuming that's how much is getting absorbed, then I'm not getting the beneficial effects. I'm getting actually anxious and irritable.
That is so, so common. We call it estrogen kickback in the group. We named it because it seems, and the way we've explained it collectively is just that low doses stimulate estrogen receptors, and that causes this estrogen progesterone tug of war. And if you continue at that low dose, it does all kinds of things, not just irritability. It creates all manner of upset. I personally, it took me, don't fall off your chair. It took me 800 milligrams of progesterone for a year, daily topical at 3%. It took me about a month to 3 months to stabilize where I stopped clotting and I stopped having really, really bad periods. And it was the most severe estrogen dominance case without having actual hormonally related cancers that a person could have. It was bad. Yeah. It took me about 3 months to balance out, and I just kept going up and going up. And every time I went up, a symptom would disappear. By the time I was at 3 months, I was still having I was having a healthy period. I was ovulating, and all my symptoms were gone. It was bliss for an entire year. And then I started playing with other doses and strengths and started having issues. But so I'm glad you said that. My next statement was going to
just want to add something a little bit in regards to that. There is a study which kind of almost directly proves that, but it was done with testosterone. So testosterone is abused by bodybuilders to both slim down and bulk up in terms of muscle. And then there's the study which used several different dosages in males. And he found out that the lower dose, which is still considered extremely high by medical standards, which was about 25 milligrams per day, actually led to increased fat mass in the males, even though it shot their testosterone levels to basically above the normal range, but slightly above the normal range. It's still considered a very high dose. Most doctors wouldn't give that dosage. They will do, maybe half of that, right? And then there was an intermediate group which got, I think, 50 milligrams per day, and they actually their fat mass didn't change, but their muscle mass grew. And then it was the high dose testosterone, which was basically the equivalent of about 100 milligrams a day, which is what bodybuilders actually happen to use on a daily basis. And those people both lost their fat and increase their muscle mass. And the explanation of the authors was that testosterone acts as a blocker of cortisol and a blocker of estrogen. But if you don't basically administer enough, it sort of like has this teasing effect on the receptors, which is what I guess you guys are discussing in the group.
Yeah.
But it spurs the body to produce more of these substances without having a sufficient amount of testosterone to oppose them. And only when you basically kind of like overwhelm the mediators of stress, cortisol and estrogen, by administering a sufficient amount of testosterone, only then really you started seeing really the benefit. But again, those people, which probably they may match the profile of the group you're working with, but those people were middle-aged, not hypogonadal men, but they're definitely suboptimal testosterone. So the typical symptoms: the midsection starts to expand, right? Body tissue starts to sag everywhere, and then they kind of wanted a little bit more oomph in their life, right? Yeah. And that's what these researchers did: separated them into 3 groups and said, well, we've been told, we've learned in medical school that you should not abuse testosterone because it has all of these bad effects, but can we also underdo it, right? And it turns out, yes, you can underdo testosterone. If you use the 25 milligram, which is considered kind of like the regular dosage, the highest that a doctor would actually consider, then you actually can make things worse. These people's, their muscle mass stayed the same and their fat mass grew. The middle dose, fat mass stayed the same, muscle mass grew, and only the very high dose, 4 times higher than what a doctor would ever consider administering, only then you started getting the V-shaped physique, which is what they want.
I mean, I can't tell you how many medical doctors I fired because they were looking at me like I was wearing a tinfoil hat when I said, I'm taking 800 milligrams of progesterone and I'm doing amazing. And that, you know, and that it would actually help me pass polyps. The higher the dose, I would shed things, you know, lining and shrink fibroids. I mean, it was incredible. And they were like, misdiagnosis, incorrect. That's not right. Like they just didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Anecdotal, you're imagining things, right? All of these things. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's like, I'm not trying to teach you tricks. I'm just reporting what's happening to me, right?
Yeah.
Who knows better than you about you? Nobody, right?
And by the way, doctor, you're fired.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, the other statement was, but you already answered it, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because now I have something to add to it, which is when I take progesterone, it converts to cortisol. Now, you just mentioned that it can, but my question is, why do we want to block cortisol? Isn't cortisol a hormone that comes in to save the day because we're under so much physical, emotional stress, and it's anti-inflammatory and comes in to help us with that? Why do we want to block it and stop it?
I don't think you want to block it and stop it fully. And if that is a message that people are somehow getting, that's not the case. In fact, people with Addison disease, which is full adrenal failure, they don't produce any cortisol. They will die within hours if you don't give them cortisol. Wow. Yeah, it's a lethal disease. And then one of the earliest experiments done by Hans Selye in Canada basically was, how can he replace what steroids had a corticoid effect and what steroids had an anti-corticoid effect, and what steroids can keep an animal alive if this animal's adrenal glands have been removed. And he basically found that progesterone was and pregnenolone to a degree, they were really mysterious steroids, because when administered in lower doses, they were able to keep the animal alive. So they're both precursors to cortisol. That's probably how some of it was converting to cortisol. But in higher doses, they actually had an anti-stress effect if the animal had an excess levels of cortisol. So really the way we should be thinking about both progesterone and pregnenolone is that if used at the right dosage, it modulates cortisol to the point where it doesn't hurt you. Now, why would cortisol hurt you? You said it's anti-inflammatory. It keeps blood sugar in normal levels, right? People with Addison's disease can actually go into a hypoglycemic coma because their cortisol is zero. And actually, that's one of the main roles of cortisol. It's not only to keep inflammation down, but also to maintain blood sugar above zero. And that's why if cortisol disappears, unless you go on replacement therapy, you're in danger of actually hypoglycemic coma or, God forbid, even dying. So anyway, so when you're under stress, cortisol rises above physiological levels. And if this continues over time, cortisol has a very powerful atrophying effect. I posted a study maybe a couple of years ago on the forum, which showed that, and Dr. Pete has mentioned in a few of his articles, but he didn't actually cite any studies. The studies demonstrated that you can reduce every symptom of aging by administering a sufficiently high dosage of cortisol. So cortisol, even though life-saving, right, it's part of the fight or flight response. And if I think everybody would agree that if your every second of your life is fight or flight, you're probably not going to be in optimal health. That's what we're trying to modulate, provide the body with additional resources such as pregnenolone and progesterone that spares the adrenals to a degree, so that they don't have to produce as much cortisol, which over time destroys every organ in your body, and especially your mental health, because it atrophies the brain. Recent studies have showed that the cortisol blocker, which is also known as the abortion pill, mifepristone, also called RU486, Dr. Pete has an article on it. Many people know it as the abortion pill, but it was actually developed as a cortisol blocker. And the French company Sanofi, when it developing in the 80s, they basically, the marketing department said, there isn't much money in selling a cortisol blocker. 1 in 10,000 people has Cushing disease, which is the disease of excessive cortisol. What else can we sell it as? And then they realized that the rising feminist movement and the demand for contraceptives and the demand for on-demand abortion, I guess, pills, basically it was a really great opportunity, because this drug also blocks the progesterone receptor. And anything blocking the progesterone receptor will induce abortion. So they said, get out of here with your cortisol blocking stuff. We're going to sell this as a progesterone blocker, which it is, but it was designed as a cortisol blocker. Long story short, studies have demonstrated that if you give people with even Cushing disease or obesity or diabetes, if you give them RU486, they actually fully cure the disease. So it's just a statement, it's just a demonstration that excess cortisol is harmful, and doing things to mitigate its effects can be very, very beneficial. Fully blocking its effects? Absolute no. I mean, it is a vital steroid without which every organism, every mammal would likely quickly perish. And then the original studies with pregnenolone, it also a precursor to cortisol, technically, demonstrated that when you give it to people, it lowers their output of adrenal steroids, which was a demonstration of the fact that pregnenolone spares your adrenals, right? And you want to spare your adrenals because your adrenal capacity is actually one of the best indicators of all-cause mortality into the future. So the better you can handle stress by producing sufficient amounts of cortisol, the more resilient you are to stress. But if you've been producing a higher than normal amount of cortisol for a very long time, that's definitely not a good sign. And pregnenolone can help get you back into the normal output of cortisol, and so does progesterone. Part of it is because they can serve as precursors. And I think part of it is because they can replace cortisol in many of its functions in the cell, specifically, as you mentioned, anti-inflammatory. Cortisol is probably best known as the strongest anti-inflammatory steroid in the body, but many other steroids are as well, including and specifically pregnenolone and progesterone. There's a study recently that came out about pregnenolone specifically, which demonstrated that it's such a powerful anti-inflammatory that now they're running a clinical trial with military veterans for low back pain, which now medicine admits is due to chronic inflammation in the GI tract, largely driven by endotoxin. So if pregnenolone and progesterone can fill in into the role of cortisol for at least some of the tissues and organs, then the body needs to produce less cortisol, and that's good news for you. It's not good news to produce zero cortisol, and it's not good news to produce a ton of cortisol, mimicking you being chased by a bear every single second of your life.
So what's to stop these raw materials, pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA even, from going down pathways that we don't want them to go down? I don't know how you feel about the Dutch test, but I do offer it, and I find it to be really fascinating. The dried urine test, and it shows your 16-OH pathway and all these different pathways, and I personally took testosterone for a while, cream topically, and I immediately turned it into estrogen, and immediately, did all the bad things with the testosterone. And I did some research about that, and I was learning that, if you have an inflammation, a chronic inflammation in the body, like if you're dealing with EBV or herpes virus or heavy metal toxicity or whatever, that you're gonna favor these unhealthy
Yes.
pathways.
Yeah.
So if who's to say that taking pregnenolone is going to do what I want it to do?
Well, a couple of things. The closer, so if you take DHEA, it's already, so the initial enzymes in the steroidogenic pathway are rate limited. And basically, they don't allow too much of that steroid to get metabolized downstream into something nefarious. So, for example, even if you take, like I said, well, at low dosages, most of the enzymes are unsaturated. So if you give them raw material, which is a precursor steroid, they will probably metabolize, as far down as possible, provided they have the sufficient cofactors present. And in many cases, the cofactors are either NAD or NADH, depending on what kind of steroid you're trying to actually synthesize. But if you take a subnormal or supraphysiological or pharmacological dosage of a precursor steroid, it tends to have a rate-limiting effect further down the stream, which is, I mentioned, the final enzyme that synthesizes cortisol in the pathway is 11-beta-HSD1. Now, if you take a sufficiently high dose of progesterone, it will directly inhibit the activity of that enzyme. So even though progesterone is a precursor to cortisol, right? If you take a sufficiently high amount of that, you will directly limit the synthesis of cortisol. Now, if you take lower amounts, you may actually synthesize more cortisol than baseline, especially if you weren't synthesizing a sufficient amount before. The Dutch test is great, but I think it needs to be paired with a blood test, because the Dutch test by itself tends to favor the picture, showing the picture of how well you glucuronidate, sulfate, and excrete the steroids. And that is largely a function of your liver and your kidneys. So the Dutch test is, at least half of it, I will take it as a how well your kidneys and liver are functioning.
I agree.
Because if you take people with cirrhosis, I'm pretty sure that the Dutch test will not be very accurate, because they have extremely impaired processing of both estrogen and the androgens. So they actually accumulate into their bodies, right? More towards the estrogen side. And these people have a very unreliable, they produce these really wacky patterns on a urine test. So if you do a Dutch test, that's good. I think it definitely has a value, especially because it measures things for which there either are no tests available to do it in blood, or extremely expensive. Because just like anything else, it's supply and demand. If you're trying to track some kind of a very strange or exotic metabolite of estrogen, such as 16-alpha hydroxyestradiol, or any of the other that go through the 16-alpha pathway, then I don't know if LabCorp or Quest even do it. I don't think they have the test. If they do it, then it's probably something very, very exotic, and then a doctor needs to order it. And out of my experience, it's usually 2 to 3 times more expensive, simply because it's so rare and probably cost them more to actually do the test. So that's where the Dutch test is really helpful. It allows you to see things that a blood test either cannot show currently, or it will be prohibitively expensive. But it will be better if it gets paired with a blood test, because then you know how well you're producing the steroids, and how well you're excreting them, and which ones your body favors excreting more.
Yeah.
For example, if you have a very high amount of estrogens being excreted in urine on the Dutch test, however, you have very low estrogens in the blood, that's probably a good sign. Even though if you only do the Dutch test, you may freak out and say, "Oh my God, I have a ton of estrogen." Well, in reality, if your liver is functioning very well and your kidneys are functioning very well, you're quickly excreting most of it, and it may show up as elevated estrogens in the urine, when in reality your body is getting rid of them, which is a good thing.
Most of the estrogens are excreted in the bowel.
Actually, both bowel and in urine as well. And I think the Dutch test is urine, right?
Yeah. And then I like it because it also shows like methylation and pumped methylation and whatnot. But I agree. I think it's just another piece to the puzzle for sure.
Saliva, blood, and Dutch together would probably be the best you can currently do. And my lab in Europe is currently working on analyzing the steroids in nail and in hair. And I'm hoping that the nail testing would actually mimic tissues. So basically, if you do like a nail test and a Dutch test, that probably would be the gold standard, because you will know what's literally happening inside of your cells. Actually, blood test will probably be good to add, because the blood test shows how well things are being distributed and how much you're producing, right? So a blood test shows the production and the distribution, and then a nail test would show accumulation in tissues, and then the Dutch test will show how well you're excreting and what the pattern is.
Wow, nails. And then throw in a little HTMA and you've got yourself a full picture of what's going on, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The hair mineral, HMT, what is it? Hair
trace mineral analysis.
Thank you. Okay, so I shouldn't have saved this to the end, but so a big part of what's going on in our group often is that, you know, women have a baby, maybe they have two babies, and then all of a sudden the weight comes and there's nothing they can do to get rid of it. And then there's women who haven't had children, but they're getting towards perimenopause and it's just like impossible. In fact, they work out and they gain weight, or they get adrenal issues because they work out. And then add to that the fasting, where they do intermittent, they wake up, they do a bulletproof coffee, and then they go work out, and then they lose weight, but then they feel like absolute crap in a month or two. Yeah. So what is going on? Why is that happening? Not just to women, but really to women, particularly at that time in life.
I think the same thing happens with men, that we have menopause as well. Andropause, let's call it andropause, because the menopause is actually for women. But the andropause is actually kicking in for males around the age of 35. It's really when the levels of DHEA, the adrenal steroids, starts to drop precipitously, both from males and females, and also testosterone from males starts to decline. However, multiple studies have looked at the actual cells into the gonads of both males and females, and they found out that they're not malfunctioning. So something's going on that's keeping the production of the youthful steroids down. And one big thing is the declining metabolic rate, but then it becomes a catch-22. Okay, so is it a declining metabolic rate that's driving the lower production of these steroids, or is the lower production of these steroids that's kind of lowering my metabolic rate? It's actually both, but ultimately the cause is external, and it comes down to diet and stress. And having a baby, it's no walk in the park. I mean, as you and I discussed, having two kids, having all these worries that are happening today, and these changes in the world that are affecting them, this keeps many people up at night. And it's a good recipe for starting to pack on the pounds. Multiple studies have shown that if you wake up only once at night, and if you do this on a regular basis, chances are that by the end of the year, you will have an extra 5 pounds of fat. And who doesn't wake up at least once a night, right?
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And that's a sign of high cortisol or high adrenaline. But anyways, back to the change of the hormonal balance. For a variety of reasons, with the declining metabolic rate and the increased impact of stress on us, the levels of estrogen and cortisol do not decline with age. Multiple studies have shown that. However, the levels of the protective steroids do decline with age. So the first thing that happens, cholesterol starts to rise. And in fact, now basically you see high cholesterol even in people in their early 20s. That's one of the first signs that your thyroid is starting to struggle, because elevated cholesterol, above all, at this point, FDA already admitted that dietary cholesterol has no role in any heart disease or any disease in general. It's your body not being able to actually utilize this cholesterol that you're either synthesizing or ingesting through the food. That's really the problem. That's the sign. That's the worrying sign. Well, what's causing it? Well, the first step of the steroidogenesis, and since all steroids are synthesized from cholesterol, the first step is called the side chain cleavage enzyme, happens in the mitochondria, and the cofactor for that first step is ATP. So lower ATP levels, which ultimately stems from lower metabolic rate, means lower utilization of cortisol. And that's why cortisol starts to build up. Now, if you don't produce sufficient amounts of cortisol, if you don't metabolize sufficient amounts of cortisol, you will not be metabolizing globally, be synthesizing sufficient amounts of pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, and testosterone, which happen to be the steroids that oppose cortisol. And out of these, pregnenolone and progesterone specifically also oppose estrogen as well. Now, estrogen is always produced. Every cell in the body contains the enzyme aromatase. So you will always be producing at least some estrogen. And it's not the absolute amounts of estrogen that matter so much, and it's not the absolute amounts of cortisol that matter so much, but it's the ratio of either cortisol to DHEA. That's a very well-established ratio at this point. Funny enough, it's happening more in psychiatry because they're showing that if the ratio of cortisol to DHEA rises above 10, you have a tremendous risk of developing depression, severe depression, psychosis, bipolar disorder, even Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson. So anyways, but it's a measure basically of the stress hormone versus the anti-stress hormone, the adrenal one. But pregnenolone and progesterone also play a role in there. And there's also the androgen to estrogen index. And basically old study that I posted on the forum showed that actually males would look fully like females if they did not produce androgens at least 50 times higher than the amount of estrogen they produce. Males produce on average between 40 to 50 micrograms of estradiol daily, which is not a small amount.
Wow.
And the only thing preventing males from looking like Samantha Fox, to use that model. Actually, that's what the study said. The only thing that prevents males from growing extremely large breasts is the fact that they produce also androgens, and they have a damping effect on basically the estrogenic phenotype. So the default phenotype in nature is female. And the only reason we have males is their ability to produce androgens. Now, as that declines with age for a variety of reasons, including lower metabolic rate, higher stress, right, poor diet, you name it, toxins in the water, toxins everywhere around us, endocrine disruptors, which unsurprisingly, every endocrine disruptor that I've seen is estrogen agonists, in other words, acts like estrogen, cortisol agonist, acts like cortisol, and thyroid antagonist. So it blocks the effects of thyroid, and some of them are even androgen antagonists. So kind of like the worst of all worlds combined, and this is in plastics, and it's everywhere around us. So all of these things combined lead to basically an environment where we're not producing enough of the steroids that oppose really the baseline, the primitive steroids that kind of keep us alive and growing, which is the cortisol, keeping the blood sugar above zero, and estrogen, which is in a sense, it's a growth hormone, and it's responsible for tissue repair. But without sufficient what should I call them, morphogenic steroids, which kind of guide this new tissue into differentiating into proper organs, then all estrogen does is produce more and more and more, and that is one of the hallmarks of cancer. Wow. Unsurprisingly, both cortisol and estrogen are capable of causing cancer. And in 2001, NIH, National Institutes of Health, officially declared estrogen as a known human carcinogen. Of course, not a mention of this on the news, but it's there. I can send you the link. It comes from a .gov website. So if anybody ever questions whether estrogen is really good or bad for us, you can send them that link. Of course, It's the dosage that matters, right? Yeah. I mean, if we are producing, if all of our cells have the enzyme aromatase, it means estrogen is actually vital to our survival. But the question is there anything there to restrain its sort of like a wild ability for growth and for wreaking havoc? And that's really what young people have, an abundance of things that steer this growth potential into the proper direction. And with age, we're little by little, because of the declining energy, really, our declining ability to produce proper energy from food, we're basically getting more and more unopposed effects of both estrogen and cortisol. And that's why if you look at very old people, they basically both look pretty much the same sex. It's very hard to distinguish very old male from a very old female. And they're all wrinkly and everything's sagging, all of these things are actually the direct effects of cortisol and estrogen, which they're not higher than younger people, but there's nothing to oppose them. So the ratio of the catabolic to the anti-catabolic hormones is extremely high, while in younger people, it's actually in the favor of the anti-catabolic. That's why they look so vivacious and full of energy and run around and basically are nice to be around. While, the concept of the old curmudgeon or the old hag, that's really all they are. It's an excess of stress steroids, and these people are constantly on the edge because they can never relax, because relaxation and interaction with the world as a normal human being requires a decent amount of energy. And if you're constantly under these stress hormones effects and there's nothing there to oppose them, you're effectively always fighting for your life, every second of your life. And that becomes increasingly more the case with advancing age.
Wow. So So ultimately this issue that's going on, I mean, not to simplify it to this, to just say it's just age, but this metabolic issue at a very, very basic bottom level is that, we're needing more energy and we're
Yeah,
not clearing out the exhaust quick enough, and we're
yeah,
basically aging rapidly.
yeah.
So the insulin, so just quickly before we wrap up, just could you tell me like my education is thought you want to fix your thyroid, fix your gut.
Right.
But you talk a lot about supplementing thyroid and how important it is. Can you say that? I know I'm keeping you over, but
For
can you?
insulin resistance, or like, I mean, in the context of insulin resistance, or in general supplementing thyroid?
Let's talk about insulin resistance. Let's
Okay.
about that.
In my experience, at least the studies that I've seen, and I myself having struggled with excess weight in the past, I can tell you 100% that to me is beyond confirmed that insulin resistance is driven by the presence of excessive amount of fatty acids in the blood. Now, some people, and this that's why most of the people with type 2 diabetes are overweight. And if they actually lose the extra weight, the vast majority of them are basically curing their type 2 diabetes. Now, of course, how you lose the weight is very important, because the way this is being encouraged by most doctors is stress yourself, diet, do this exhaustive exercise, etc., etc. So they lose the excess weight, but then when they stop all of these things because of the high stress hormones, because when somebody's pushing you to overexert yourself, clearly you're going to having higher cortisol, higher estrogen, right? And then as soon as you stop, these high stress hormones will actually allow you to not only gain back all the weight you lost, even at actually reduced calories than before, but actually overshoot that weight. There's a link I posted on the forum a couple of years ago about that TV show, The Greatest Loser. I don't know why they call it that way, because it turned out sadly very extremely accurate. Every single one of the participants there not only regained their weight, but they're now up to 2 times heavier than what they used to be. And some of these people were weighing 300, 400 pounds. So imagine that. And the reason is that it turns out that all of this weight loss that they achieved during the show was done through supplementing things that were raising their adrenaline. They were increasing the fatty acid oxidation. These people were extremely overworked and through exercise and whatnot, just so that the show can be commercially successful. And as soon as they stopped, as soon as they dropped out, even though they maintained the diet at the level, the caloric level that was during the show, they regained their weight. So in other words, their metabolic rate was destroyed. And several studies have demonstrated that actually, if you allow people to eat, most of them don't get, basically the weight gain is not unlimited. They actually stabilize around a certain weight. And it turns out that it's an adaptive mechanism, not a good one, but better than being skinny and extremely hypometabolic. It's an adaptive mechanism because people with higher body mass tend to have higher metabolic rate. So that was the body's way for a person who is under extreme stress. The body says, oh my God, the environment is not good. As soon as I get some extra food, or even the food that I'm getting right now, I better not use it. I better store it, right? So I better get these extra calories, because the world outside is showing me that things are stressful. And when the things are stressful, I cannot afford to be burning high amounts of calories. I cannot afford to be reproducing. I cannot afford to be happy. I cannot afford to be doing all of these higher cognitive functions like art, or high-level science, because all of these are luxuries in nature when the amount of energy is insufficient. And by stressing yourself, you're kind of showing your organism that basically things are not good, and the body should be extremely judicious with how it uses the food for energy. And what the body does is says, okay, I'm going to do the bare minimum to keep you alive, and the rest I'm going to store as fat. And basically the hormones that the body uses to achieve these things are estrogen and cortisol. So conversely, if you want to lose that extra fat, the way to do it, and the way the bodybuilders and elite athletes do it, by the way, elite athletes never diet, never ever diet. If they have to lose weight, they always do it through medication. They never do it through calorie restrictions, or at least not these extreme things that we're seeing. They always do it through medication. Usually there's an old drug called dinitrophenol, DNP. Used to be, was like all the rage back in the 1920s and 30s for weight loss. And it's a metabolic uncoupler. It actually drastically increases your metabolic rate. And basically that's how these people lose weight. That's the proper way to lose weight,
It
by
is.
burning off the
Aren't these
calories.
people going into, kidney failure as they age?
Oh yeah,
Isn't
yeah. I'm
Arnold
just saying that
Schwarzenegger needing like,
yeah, of course, you can always overdo it, but I'm saying the way
okay,
to do it without ruining your metabolic rate is actually you should be struggling, you should be fighting to increase your metabolic rate, not decrease it. And unfortunately, extreme dieting and extreme exercise lead to decreased metabolic rate through the effects of rising cortisol and estrogen. Both of these have a direct suppressive effect on the thyroid, and both of these are basically signs that you cannot have simultaneously a high metabolic rate and high stress. You cannot. The body will consume itself, right? So when things are extremely stressful, you slow down. Your body slows you down to the point where you're only keeping the basic functions alive, like such as searching for food, potentially fighting off, people that are trying to steal your food or water or whatnot, right? And it's not a coincidence that the Renaissance and all the historical periods that actually led to advancement of civilization, they never happened during starvations and wars and things like that. They always happened during a relative time of peace and abundance. I mean, I don't think I'll be surprising anybody if I tell you that if you're starving, if you're starving Michelangelo or starving Leonardo da Vinci, you're not going to be painting those masterpieces that are in the Louvre.
right,
You'll be running around and trying to get bread or whatever is available locally.
right, the
And the
struggling
same thing
artist.
applies here. So so insulin resistance really is a sign that you have a lower metabolic rate, something has lowered it. And then the things that it could be due to the food you eat. Many of the things we eat are metabolic inhibitors. Could be also due to the stress, as I mentioned. The stress hormones, cortisol and estrogen, directly suppress your metabolic rate and increase the synthesis and storage of fat, right? It could be also the endocrine disruptors. It's a combination of things, but the way to lose the extra weight is not by overexerting yourself, because you're contributing to the stress signal. Fat means stressed by definition. Now, of course, if an extremely stressed may be lean, but that's not maintainable for a very long period of time. I don't know of a single person who lost their weight through extreme dieting and some extreme measures and managed to keep it off, because ultimately they found out that they started gaining weight even at the drastically reduced caloric intake that they used to actually get slim. The body said, oh my God, 700 calories a day. Okay, you lost all the weight, but if that's the new baseline, and since you've told me that life is very hard by overexerting yourself, guess what? I'm going to find a way to start storing calories even at 700 calories a day. And the way this happens is by shutting down more and more of your non-essential, luxurious functions that actually is what makes us humans. Wow. If you look at cancer as the extreme, cancer is actually a regression of evolution to a very primitive life stage, kind of like a bacteria or amoeba. All it does is eat and grow, and there's no shape to it. That's really what cancer is. It's a shapeless, unlimited growth, and the two of the hormones that promote it excessively are cortisol and estrogen. And conversely, if you want to get away from that phenotype, is increasing the metabolic rate, which allows for actually shaping things into organs and whatnot, and then reducing overall stress. So the anti-stress hormones are one way. And if people don't do well on progesterone, I have clients who actually went to the doctor and said, give me RU486. And the doctor agreed, especially if they had visibly excess weight, and these people lost their weight. I'm not recommending it. I'm saying it's a corroboration that the excess weight is due to excessive amounts of stress hormones, or at least amounts that are not opposed by the anti-stress hormones, such as pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA. Something as simple as blocking cortisol is able, and there's a study which I can show you, it said sustained weight loss in people with Cushing disease after getting the RU486 without any restriction in calories. In fact, these people started eating more and they still kept losing weight.
Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot. You see that with some athletes and some people who, who just eat whatever they want. I did most of my young life to say whatever I want. My problem was I didn't eat when I should have been eating. I would starve myself a lot.
Not good, because
yeah.
But look, they call it the blunder years. We've all been through these.
Yeah.
We all learn. And the good news is you can always change course.
Right.
And I guess simple rule of thumb is if you're not enjoying it, chances are it's probably not good for you in the long run.
Right.
It may be worth doing it briefly, just to, if it's something like of life-saving nature. But if you have to feel like you have to fight through it, and if you have to do this on a daily basis, chances are it's not good to you, because just a mental effort of doing that is going to raise your serotonin, and serotonin is actually the cardinal controller aside from thyroid, but it's the cardinal non-thyroid controller of the metabolic rate. And drugs that are blocking serotonin or inhibiting in synthesis are currently in human clinical trials, and have raging success in curing diabetes, type 2 obesity, insulin resistance, and all kinds of problems that were thought to be just people getting older. No, it's with the passage of time, we're getting hypometabolic, but there's nothing natural to aging, and there's nothing natural to the so-called age-related diseases. They're all driven by ultimately low availability of energy and excessive stress.
Wow. I mean, that's how it feels. I certainly noticed a difference from 40 to 50, and I'm just like, okay, it's starting to feel like exactly like you just described.
It's like a struggle, right? It's like a
Yeah.
struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, that you're wonderful. I really appreciate your time so much. I could go on, and hopefully I can have you back and we can dig deeper
Sure,
into other
sure.
topics.
Absolutely.